Hello everyone and welcome back. Today we are talking about my February reads for 2024. I cannot believe February is almost over. I swear I just looked at my calendar and it said February 1st and now it is the end of the month and it's almost March and I am flabbergasted with how quickly this year is already going by. It's only just begun. So let's go ahead and get started. I feel like the drink that I'm holding in my hand right now really encapsulates Valentine's Day in February. Just overall, I have a wine glass full of champagne, some raspberry lemonade, some strawberries, and an ice cube that has been molded to look like a rose. And I bought that off of Amazon and it was super amazing and it makes your drink look so much prettier. And this drink is perfect for Valentine's Day, especially since it has champagne, it has lemonade, and you can really add lemonade to your champagne to really sweeten it out and make it nice and special. I highly recommend doing that. So anyway, let's get started. I've read 10 books in the month of February, which is super amazing. I am super excited because I am on track to finish my reading goal for 2024, which is again 125 books because I am a creature of habit. Last year I was able to read 125 books and this year I hope to do the same. And to start off February of 2024, I read Hood Feminism by Mikki Kendall, and that was a book I decided to read in spirit of Black History Month. And I thought this book was really important. I went into it really excited to learn some new things, and I did. I feel like Mikki Kendall really was able to not only summarize but also analyze a lot of social justice issues that apply to not just Black people in general but also Black women, and how the feminist movement usually focuses on white feminism as opposed to feminism for women of all races. And while I really enjoyed this book, I really enjoyed how the author talked about how social justice issues like accessibility to food, accessibility to medicine, to public transportation, to decent education. I like how all of that really exemplified the issues that we still experience today. I felt like I was falsely advertised to when I started reading this book, and let me explain how. So the subtitle of Hood Feminism is Notes from the Women That the Movement Forgot. And that was a bit misleading for me because I went into this book thinking that, oh great, I'm going to learn about all the women in the past, like suffragette movements, like the 1970s, like the second wave feminism, and learn all about the women that were still impactful to the feminist movement in the past. Because again, forgot that past tense made me think, oh, okay, this was in the past. Like this is about women that have already existed, that have already had their place in the feminist movement, and it wasn't like that at all. And I'm not blaming the author for this because I feel like this could have been a publisher issue as well. Maybe I should have read the back cover or the summary of the book beforehand, but again, I refuse to do that because I was lied to twice in January. I thought I was reading completely different books, and then I dove into them, and I was like, oh, like, this is not what I thought this book was going to be about at all, and I was super frustrated. And I went to this book trying to be completely blind. I only looked at the cover. The cover still lied to me. I felt like I was going into this reading a book about women of the past because, again, the word forgot made me think, okay, this is of the past. And I thought that subtitle was really ironic because in her book, Mikki Kendall talked about how a lot of children, a lot of Americans are raised in not only educational spaces but also cultural spaces, thinking that racism is a thing of the past. I thought that was really ironic that her subtitle suggested that we were learning about women in the past tense, like women who have existed before, who fought for the women's suffragette movement, who fought for the feminist movement in the past, when really all the issues that Kendall was talking about are issues that still exist to this day that still affect people of color. So I was a little bit taken aback by that. And again, I went into this book thinking I was reading a completely different book, and I just feel frustrated because it's almost like in order to navigate the space of books nowadays, you can't even trust the cover anymore. You literally have to basically spoil the book for yourself to get any kind of natural, truthful indication of what this book is going to turn out to be. So I was incredibly frustrated. Not with the author. I thought the book was still really well written. I thought that a lot of the anecdotes she shared about her own life were very raw, very poignant, very moving. But again, the subtitle suggested I would be learning about more than one woman's experience with the feminist movement and not one person in general. I still found the book to be incredibly insightful. I thought that the author made a lot of very valid, very important points when it came to women of color and the feminist movement. I still really enjoyed this book. I still gave it 3 stars, but again, I feel like I dove into this reading experience thinking I would get something completely different out of it, but I still learned a lot, and I feel like it's a really good book to read for Black History Month. I just wish I was not lied to when I first initially dove in and started reading this book. So Hood Feminism by Mickey Kendall, definitely recommend it. It's a very good read, just a good nonfiction read overall, but keep in mind that the subtitle does not actually directly reflect what the book is about. Fair warning ahead of time. Also, a lot of content warnings. There are instances of course, genocide, slavery, mentions of sexual abuse, physical abuse, marital abuse, or sexual assault against women, rape as well. This book does deal with a lot of very difficult topics, so I would definitely steel yourself before going in. This is not an easy read, but it is a very important and worthwhile read overall. And then, in the spirit of the romance genre, I decided to read Call Me By Your Name by Andre Aciman. And I initially saw the movie with Armie Hammer and Timothée Chalamet first before I read this book a couple years ago. It was like pre-pandemic when I saw the movie, and then I decided to read it now, dipping my toes into the literary fiction romance genre, and I really enjoyed this book. This was not the first book-to-movie adaptation that I read this month that included Armie Hammer in the movie adaptation, unfortunately, but whatever, it's okay. I'm not too mad about it now. But if you're unfamiliar with this book, Call Me By Your Name focuses on the love affair between the very young Elio and the much older, prominent Professor Oliver. Elio lives in Italy, and Oliver is actually traveling and staying with Elio's family in their Italian countryside home. And they strike up this friendly bond in which Elio is very obsessed with Oliver. He watches Oliver as he is reading out by his parents' pool in the place he calls his heaven, and he is very watchful of his every movements, of his every actions, and there are some very graphic scenes of masturbation in this book, including but not limited to the infamous peach scene. I'm not going to do the disservice of describing it to you right now, but I think that this book does a really good job of exemplifying what it's like for young and first love for Elio and for Oliver. But again, this book is very interesting because it's Elio realizing and coming to terms with his own sexuality and, of course, exploring that with Oliver. And although I really enjoyed this book, I think Andre Aciman as an author is incredibly talented. I didn't necessarily enjoy the age gap between Elio and Oliver. There is a bit of a power dynamic between the two of them where Oliver is a little more sexually and romantically experienced than Elio is, of course, because Elio is a 17-year-old boy. And unfortunately, there is a little bit of cheating that goes throughout their affair. Like, Elio is very flirtatious and gets involved with a woman from his hometown who is also an expat like Oliver. And this book is trying to hone in on Elio and struggling with his own identity and struggling with his ability to be open and vulnerable and intimate with the person he actually wants to be open and vulnerable and intimate with, who is Oliver. And the multiple affairs happening within that one affair did kind of taint the experience for me, as well as the age gap. But overall, I think that Call Me By Your Name is a great story. I like the ambiguous ending at the end because it didn't really, it was kind of a bittersweet ending where it was both sad, but it was also very happy and hopeful. And apparently there was a sequel to this book that came out last year, and I did not hear about it at all. And I was just made privy of it like a couple weeks ago. So I am tempted to read the sequel, but overall I think the book did a really great job of exploring what it's like to struggle with not only your own sexuality and identity, but also with the intimacy of having your first love. Call Me By Your Name, definitely highly recommend. 4 out of 5 stars. For February 2024, I have Divine Rivals by Rebecca Ross. So Divine Rivals is all about these two journalists. So you have Iris and Roman, and it's an enemies to lovers romance story. It takes place in this World War I inspired fantasy land. So instead of just normal London, England, you have London, England, but if there were gods that lived amongst humans, and these gods are dead. The one critique I do have of Divine Rivals is the fact that there seems to be very lackluster world building. This book lacked the exposition dump that I need for most stories like this, because unless your book has anything to do with Greek mythology or modern fairy tales, I needed a lot more exposition when it came to this world, because unlike a lot of the books I read last year where they're based off of fairy tales like Cinderella or off Greek gods like Hades, Persephone, I did not know who Dakra and Enva are. I didn't know who the other gods are. Their names were dropped really early on in the book, and then we just skip forward towards the romance. And I understand that's kind of a common issue with romantasy nowadays, because the authors tend to focus more on the romance as a forefront, while the fantastical world is more in the background, and it's treated like an afterthought, which can be fine. Again, some people just want those vibe only kind of books where they just have a sprinkling of this new world and they focus more on the love between two people. But I definitely needed more context, especially since this world takes place in World War I era timeline when it came to London. I did not know that this book actually took place in London until I read reviews about the book. So besides the lackluster world building, I actually, in a rare moment, when it came to romance fiction, I actually was rooting for these characters a lot. So Iris and Roman are professional rivals, and they're basically both fighting for a promotion at their job, and they're both very talented writers. The only difference is Iris is very poor. Both Roman and Iris have typewriters, and these typewriters are kind of like related, like they're sister typewriters, and they are magically connected. We don't know exactly how, because again, nothing's really explained to us in a relevant way in this story. And these two typewriters are connected, and whenever they write letters, they like kind of put it through the wardrobe of their rooms, and they magically are transported to the other person's room. It would have been kind of cool if their typewriters were linked in a way where they started writing messages and then it was sent kind of like the Chamber of Secrets way, where Harry Potter wrote in the journal and it disappeared, and then new ink would reappear when the other person on the other side was responding to it. That would have been kind of cool, but whatever. So they start exchanging these letters, and at first, Iris thinks that she is writing letters to her brother Forrest. But then it's later revealed that the person she's been writing to this whole time is not Forrest, it's this man named Carver. And they start writing back and forth, and Roman the whole time, he knows that is Iris that he's writing to, but Iris does not know that it is Roman that she is writing to. Okay, Rebecca Ross had moments where she had really prosaic, really amazing writing that shook me to my very core, and then the next page she would shift gears and she would say something so cringy or something so trite that it made me retreat back and be like, oh shoot, that wasn't very good. There's a lot of historical anachronisms too when it comes to how modern these two speak, and even though it's based off of World War I, they did have very different colloquialisms than we do today. And there are a lot of things that they talked about that kind of took me out of the story, especially when Roman said, oh, I like baseball. And I'm like, I'm done. How can you exist in a world where you have physical gods fighting each other and still have enough time to enjoy baseball? Like, that was crazy. And they're supposed to be, like, in the war trenches, like in London. Like, I'm pretty sure baseball is an American pastime. I'm not saying that British people can enjoy American things, but it was very strange to be like, oh yeah, this book takes place in Europe, and then it's like, baseball. Okay, whatever. To each their own, but still, I was like, whatever. It took me out of the story. It made me very distracted. That's not the point of this book at all. But I will say that the romance between Roman and Iris was actually pretty decent. I liked how they progressed from enemies to lovers in a very natural way. It took the competition part out of it. They had no real reason to hate each other, and I liked how Roman kind of went against the grain when it came to his family. So his family wanted him to marry this one woman, and he didn't want to do that because he cared for Iris, so he ran away to the front where she was reporting as a war correspondent because she was trying to find her brother, and he went to follow her, and then just chaos ensues. I really liked that part of it because it kind of shed light on the fact that Roman was following his own morals because his family was doing some shady stuff that he didn't agree with, and he went against the grain and he fought for what he really cared about, which I liked when it comes to a love story. And oh yeah, another critique I have this story, sorry, I'm a little bit all over the place. It's been a couple weeks since I finished this book. But another critique I have with this book is the fact that the conflict is written off so quickly. Like, for example, every time Roman and Iris get into a sticky situation, within the next chapter, the conflict is immediately solved, or it's solved off the page. Like, we don't get to see the conflict or how it unravels before our very eyes. And it just kind of felt like Rebecca Ross was just trying to skirt over major conflict points, which is ironic because at the very end of the story, it ends on a cliffhanger in which one of the main characters is in a very sticky situation with Docker, like the evil god. Didn't really feel like there were any stakes when it came to the book, because I knew immediately after every difficult scene that it'd be immediately wrapped up in no time at all. So I'm not really worried about that main character. For the next book, The Ruthless Vows, I feel like that conflict will be written up super quickly. They're going to get their happily ever after. But overall, it wasn't a terrible book. I will say that of all the romantasy fiction I've read so far, this is definitely one of my favorites. And I gave it a 2 stars, so it's definitely not the genre for me. Next book on my list is another 4-star literary fiction read, and that is Rebecca by Daphne du Maurier. And this book is exceptionally interesting to me because the titular character of the story is not the main character, but actually the ex-wife, which is very fascinating. So, this book follows our main heroine who remains unnamed throughout the whole story. You kind of get glimpses of what her name could possibly be throughout the whole novel, but it's never really explicitly said. And our heroine works kind of like a lady's companion. Basically, she's a maid, and she is hired to follow this woman around, and when they go to Monte Carlo, they meet Maxim de Winter. Maxim de Winter recently lost his wife, Rebecca. The main heroine, our hero, doesn't really know why, but they start to strike up this bond, and they develop this relationship very quickly. And then when our main character's boss tells her that they're going to New York, she runs and tells Maxim, who decides that he wants to marry her and take her back to become Mrs. De Winter. And this book is very fascinating because the entire time you're realizing that this main character is kind of used as a placeholder or as a foil for Rebecca De Winter. So the entire book, she is constantly being compared to Rebecca. Not just with Mrs. Danvers, who is the housekeeper at Manderley, but also with Maxim's friends, with Rebecca's old friends, with his family. They're constantly comparing her to Rebecca. And this entire time you get this sense that Rebecca's spirit is still present in the house, like she's still haunting Maxim and our main character, and they're never really going to shake off this ghost. And as the book progresses, our main character, she discovers all these secrets about Rebecca, like the secret boathouse where Rebecca was having an affair, and how Rebecca really died. And I won't really spoil the ending because I think you definitely should read this book. So I really like this book because it goes from just being a piece of Gothic literature to being a murder mystery really quickly. And I really enjoyed that shift here. And I loved how this book got its literary resurgence again on Book Talk, because it does have a lot of elements that Book Talk enjoys, like with Mexican Gothic. You have this Gothic literary tale about this woman who is trying to help her cousin get out of a very difficult, abusive household in a haunted house. And here, the book, Manderley is haunted by Rebecca's lingering ghost. I like all the symbolism there. And Mrs. Danvers embodies the spirit of Rebecca, who is bitter and resentful that her husband was able to move on so quickly after she passed away. And I thought that was really fascinating. I enjoyed the idea that our main character wasn't given a name, further honing in on the symbolism of the new wife trying to fill in the space of the old wife, and mostly being compared to her and not even allowed her own identity, because she goes from being this nameless person to being someone else's wife. So I thought that was really interesting. I really liked how the whole book progressed in a very natural, very fun way. I liked the murder mystery aspect of it because Rebecca's body, spoiler alert, was discovered and they suspected foul play, and how the ending, it was really a question of whether or not Rebecca won at the end. Now that I think of it, I think I might give this book 5 stars. I think I changed my mind. After explaining it and getting so excited about it, yeah, Rebecca deserves my 5 stars. Next up, we have another disappointing book, and that is Gideon the Ninth by Tamsin Muir. I was so disappointed with this book because I started off really liking it in the very beginning, and then As the book progressed, I fell out of love with it, and I was not happy about it. So, anyway, if you're unfamiliar with Gideon the Ninth, one of the many book talk darlings that exists on TikTok, it is basically this lesbian necromancer sci-fi fantasy book about this cavalier named Gideon the Ninth. And Gideon the Ninth is part of the Ninth House, and they're known for necromancy. Necromancy, if you're unfamiliar with it, is basically where you can bring the dead back to life, and primarily skeletons. And she works for this woman named Harrow, and really hates Gideon. Harrow is the leading necromancer of the Ninth House, and she's like this prodigy. Like, she is more powerful than her parents before her grandparents before her. Like, she is the most magical of them all. And she decides that she wants to try her hand at being a lictor. Lictor is where you become immortal, and you gain powers and prestige far beyond your wildest dreams. And the way to become a lictor is to basically go to capital of their galaxy, basically win all these tests. You get a bunch of keys that can open doors, to solve puzzles, solve mysteries, to gain knowledge, to gain power in order to get the final prize. Gideon works with Harrow, and this is her only way to freedom, but as they are working to get Harrow the Lecton status or to win the prize at the very end, there are people that are getting killed off, not just cavaliers who are working for their necromancers, but also necromancers as well. And throughout the story, the necromancy, how it works, the magic system is like they have to prick themselves and to draw blood in order to activate the magic. And there is a lot of gore, a lot of graphic violence when it comes to that, a lot of self-harm, so make sure you watch out for that. And I initially liked the writing voice because Gideon is very wisecracky, she is very sassy, she curses a lot, which I thought was a really breath of fresh air for a lot of books, because you don't get a lot of books in which characters freely curse, especially female characters. So I really like that aspect of it. But then over time, the writing voice became very grating, and it just kind of became overwhelming at a certain point. And especially when you find out the reason why Harrow hates Gideon, that's when the book took a turn for me. And this book had a lot to do with violence against children, which I did not like, and if you don't want to be spoiled, you can just skip ahead to when I'm not holding this book up anymore. But basically, in order to gain her necromancy status, Harrow's parents had to kill a bunch of babies, like almost 200, basically infanticide, in order to give Harrow her powers. Like, there is basically like a ritual in which they have to commit massive infanticide in order to give her the ability to be the greatest necromancer of all time. And I just didn't like that. I didn't like how Harrow painted it as like she was a true victim out of all of it, and not Gideon. So Gideon was the only baby to survive the poisoning. So again, they committed the infanticide, they poisoned all these babies, and Gideon was the only one to survive. They don't really go into the nitty-gritty of why that happened, even though it's like basically God tier, like she could survive poisoning that other babies couldn't, and they never questioned why. And Harrow's like, oh, you're just a reminder that I was basically born out of all this disgusting blood. And they're like, once she found out the true secret, she unlocked the tunnel to this monster, and which basically forced her parents to take their own lives as well. And I was like, what is happening? It was just trauma on trauma on trauma. And just like, okay, so not only do you have infanticide on top of infanticide, you also have your parents taking their own lives because you found out the secret even though you knew the whole time. And it was just a lot that I was not expecting to see in this book, and it just kind of felt like it was all used for shock value. I just didn't like it. And also the main character dies at the end of the book, and I was like, why? What is happening? And the book still continued even after Gideon the Ninth sacrificed her life so Harrow could live. And I'm like, I'm sorry, what? Oh, I could not stand it. I hate it. I did not care about Harrow by the end of the book. I did not relate to her. I was not emotionally attached to her at all. I liked Gideon the most out of all of them. I wanted her to end up with like the sickly princess, but of course they had to character assassinate her so Harrow looked better. Oh yeah, this very sickly princess, it was so much worse that she used her cavalier as a puppet. Meanwhile, Harrow got her parents killed and hundreds of other babies just so she could exist. Yeah, that's not worse. That's not worse at all. Gideon the Ninth, 2-star read for me. The only reason I gave it a 2 stars was because the writing voice was kind of clever and funny, and I like that part. Everything else about the book, unnecessary shock value for me. The next book on my list was an unfortunate read for me, and it was called The Celebrants by Stephen Rowley. Now, The Celebrants is a book all about these 5 friends who, after the passing of their good friend in college who died by suicide, they realized that he never really got to experience or understand how they all really felt about him, and they all felt personally responsible. Like, if their friend knew how much they loved him, maybe he wouldn't have taken his own life. So they have this contract where they say before each of them dies, they want to hold a living funeral for them. So after a huge life experience happens, like for example, one of them got divorced, another one lost her parents, another one got a cancer diagnosis, another one was about to go to prison, they all come together to let them, each of them, know in this dark, really traumatic time of their lives how much they're loved and how much they appreciated, so that way they know that before they pass away, which I was initially very intrigued by that aspect. I like the idea of the living funeral, or at least being more open and vulnerable with your friends. And I don't feel like we do this enough as a human race, and I would love to normalize this a lot more. However, I feel like this book really dropped the ball on so many aspects. It got to a point where I could not relate to any of the characters. I actually hated a lot of the characters, to be honest. And the one thing I will say about this book, though, that really dropped the ball for me was the fact that none of the characters were likable. In fact, they were all pretty insufferable in their own way. And the worst part of it all was that 2 of the characters were gay and in a relationship together, and their names were so similar that I got confused. Like, sometimes I thought they were talking about one character versus the other. Their names were Jordy and Jordan. So easy to get mixed up. I'm like, why do these 2 men have the same name? Why would you do that and just deliberately confuse your audience? And the part that made me lose faith in the book and just basically hate read the rest of the book was when this one character lost her parents, and her parents were very stoic, very distant, very cold to her, and they died in a plane accident. And she was very understandably shocked and surprised by the sudden tragic occurrence, and the big crux of her resentment was when they were trying to call her from the plane ride to tell her goodbye and that we love you, and unfortunately this is the last time you're going to hear from us. She decides not to pick up the call. So there's a lot of self-loathing and guilt and remorse that came with that, which would be really cool if they explored that part more, but they didn't. Instead, this woman thought that she could weaponize her own grief, force her friends to go skydiving, even though many of them said they did not want to, that they did not feel comfortable doing it. And so she forces these people to go skydiving, and then by the end of the trip, she doesn't even end up going because she has a panic attack. Force her friends to do something that they didn't want to do, even though she didn't do it anyway. And then on top of it all, she decides to commandeer the plane. Yes, they went to Mexico, and she decided that she wanted to fly the plane even though she has no flying experience. All because her parents died. Like, I understand you're going through a tough time right now, but that does not mean that you get to put other people's lives at risk. Like, they almost crashed the plane. And then at the end of it, she's super shocked that people are mad at her, and she's being like, oh, why are you mad at me? I'm the victim here. I'm the one who lost my parents. Like, no! You don't get that card. There is no, my parents are dead, therefore I can ruin other people's lives. There's no card for that. And the person that got understandably mad at her for risking their lives and forcing them to do a very dangerous stunt that could have hurt them, all because her parents died in a plane crash. Like, and he was the villain. And it's like, oh, you can't be mad at her. Yeah, you can be mad at her. That behavior is not okay. That's insane to me. And after that, her name was Naomi. So Naomi, after Naomi pulled this insane stunt where she risked the lives of her friends, where she decided to have a panic attack on a plane that she was trying to pilot herself without any previous experience, after that point, I was done with the book. And that was not even halfway through. I still had to suffer through the other half of the book just to get through it, just to say that I finished it for the glory of the reading goal. Book. had such a decent premise in the beginning, and it completely fumbled the ball. I did not like it. I did not like all the soap opera drama that was happening within the friend group. I didn't like the fact that they would pounce on this one character for doing something completely shitty and yet let this other person get away with almost murder. Like, that was not fair. And as a liberal myself, I felt like the author was trying to beat me over the head with all of these issues when it came to like morality and social justice and rights for everyone. The book was trying to really hammer down the issues of gay rights, of gay marriage, of racial issues for people of color. These messages are important, but they were done so explicitly in such a juvenile way that lacked any nuance whatsoever, and it just took me out of the book altogether. Honey, you're preaching to the choir. I know this. You do not need to tell me this in a very ham-fisted way. It was just very unnatural. And then to top it all off, these people that the author was trying to convince me were in their late 40s to 50s, were acting like teenagers. I cannot stand books where adults are acting like children. It just takes me out of it completely. So yeah, The Celebrants by Stephen Rowley. Interesting idea, terrible execution. Next up on our list, we have My Year of Rest and Relaxation by Otessa Moshfegh. And this book is all about our narrator who is fed up with life. She's just bored, she's tired of it, so she wants to spend the entire year sleeping through it. Which, again with the trajectory of our current society, I can totally relate to this. There are days where I just want to hide away from the world, just kind of burrow down into my bed, just cover myself with a nice warm blanket, drink some tea, watch some movies, and just forget that the world outside exists at all. This book definitely did hinder on the side of very privileged white woman lore, where our narrator was able to afford to just shut off from the world, not really interact with it, not need a job at all. She had quite a bit of savings, very nice credit score. She didn't really have to pay any bills with her apartment. She could just stay there, live her life, and just exist. And basically she has this therapist who is basically, she manipulates into giving her a bunch of sleeping pills and medication so she is able to sleep days at a time all the way through. And it was just a very unhealthy situation for her, where she was internalizing all this trauma of losing her parents one after the other, of losing her romantic relationship, and just feeling really lost and alone in the world, especially after her parents, who never really gave her full affection, died. And she's just really grappling with the issues of not really receiving any parental affection and just feeling lost and alone in the world, even though she has a very nice best friend who wants to take care of her. And I didn't really like this book until the character really came to terms with all of her internalized trauma and just realizing that there are a lot of issues that she really needs to work out, and she can't just rely on medication. Instead, she really needs to focus on living. The one thing I will say about this book, though, is that she had a lot of very outdated ideas. This book takes place in the early 2000s and goes until 2001, so there is a mention of 9/11 in there, which had a very interesting interpretation of events. She talked about how a woman who flung herself off of one of the top floors of the Twin Towers and flinging herself down below, and how she looked more alive than ever. And I was like, okay, that's an interesting interpretation. And she called, at one point, the narrator, she was talking about her ex-boyfriend's new girlfriend and her son, and she used the R word for him, and her son was mentally disabled. And I did not appreciate that, not just as a teacher, but as a human being. Like, you can't just call a kid the R word. Like that, I didn't like the fact that the narrator was taking out her frustration of her ex-boyfriend onto this child that she never knew. I did not like that at all. I didn't like her interpretation of events at the 9/11 building. I did like, at the very end of the story, how the narrator decided that she couldn't just hide, she couldn't just like shut herself off completely from the world, and that she had to actually live and find a reason to live through that. Again, still a very watered down version of mental health. I understand a lot of what the author was trying to say of how there are just days where people just want to just shut out the world, just exist on their own, not really needing to deal with the reality of the world and especially the trauma that they experience in their lives and what's happening in the world around them at this very difficult time. But I feel like it could have been done a little bit better. I did like the author's writing voice a lot. I think Otessa Moshfegh is a very talented author, but this book is a bit of a slog. As you can imagine, reading about someone who just wants to sleep for a full year is not the most exciting thing in the world. But I did like a lot of the things, a lot of the issues that the author touched on, especially with mental health. I was ironically intrigued when the narrator was talking about how the medications were making her sleepwalk. Like, there were days where she would go out clubbing, she didn't even realize it. She would sleepwalk to the nearest like Chinese takeout place and just leave a Chinese takeout throughout her apartment. It was just rotting and gross, but she was like waking up and realizing that she was doing things without her knowledge. I thought that was pretty interesting. But otherwise, I don't know, I just felt very neutral about this book. I was skimming through a lot of it just to get to the end. I did like the end, how she was talking about how, you know, we need to find a reason to live. We need to experience the world because we are all here and we need to be alive and willing to accept the world in its good and bad times. That's probably why I did give it a 3 out of 5 stars, but it's a very complicated relationship I have with this book because even though I enjoyed parts of it, I would not recommend it to a lot of people. Because again, it deals with the issues of self-harm, of medical abuse, of drug abuse, especially with medication when it comes to mental health. There's a lot of depression, anxiety. Also mentioned the 9/11 terrorist attack, and it talks about family issues, sexual assault, and just like parental neglect. So I would definitely warn you about that stuff before you read this book. It does deal with a lot of those issues, and yeah, it's not an easy read. It's not necessarily a fun read a lot of the times, but I don't know. TikTok recommended this book to me, so I read it. My Year of Rest and Relaxation, 3 out of 5 stars. It was just chronically okay. Next up on my list, I have Red, White, and Royal Blue by Casey McQuiston. This is my second entry into Casey McQuiston's writing, and I have to say this definitely is my favorite so far. I read I Kissed Shara Wheeler last year, and this book I definitely have to say is my favorite. I think it's definitely superior to I Kissed Shara Wheeler because it is not based off of another book. It's definitely original, despite the fact that it's kind of like a fan fiction. So this book takes place in a world that answers the question, what if Donald Trump was not elected, but instead we got a female president? Definitely a liberal's fantasy. I did enjoy that aspect of it. It was like, oh, it was nice to dream, you know, a little bit, see what the world would have been like if we had a female president and a Prince of Wales that happened to have a relationship with the U.S. president's son. So this book is basically about the son of the U.S. president named Alex and Prince Harry's fictional character Henry. And these two are enemies to lovers in the very beginning because Alex has always had a bit of beef with Henry because Henry has always been so cold and distant towards him ever since he's been the first son, so to speak. And these two finally come to a head at Prince Henry's brother's wedding. So Prince Philip is getting married, and Prince Henry and his sister are invited to go to the reception. And at the reception, Alex gets rip-roaring drunk, and he decides to approach Henry, and the two of them fall into the very expensive cake. And it basically devolves into this whole scandal that is titled Cakegate. And after Cakegate, the president, so Alex's mom, is very upset at her son because this is her re-election year and she's fighting for her second term as the first female president, and the last thing she needs on her hands is a scandal. So she tells Alex, you need to pretend to be friends with Prince Henry in order to repair our international relationship with Great Britain. So Alex and Henry are kind of forced into this friendship together. So it's kind of like fake dating, but in a platonic way. So he and Henry are basically forced to act like friends, and they have to go to all these events together, and one of them is a New Year's Eve party at the White House. Well, in Washington, D.C. I'm resident to say it's at the White House. I think it's just in Washington, D.C. And Alex and Henry are finally getting to a point where they're actually friends, like they've been texting for a while, and I really like the banter between them two. They're a very cute couple. and then they end up kissing at the New Year's Eve party in secret, and they develop this secret toward love affair, and then eventually their affair comes to light. I was initially drawn into the book in the very beginning because I liked their banter. I usually don't like it when a couple's relationship is reduced to text or email conversations, because I feel like it feels very unnatural and a little too realistic to the world that we have today. But I actually enjoyed the conversations these two had together. I thought their banter was very cute in the very beginning because they were friends, they're still trying to navigate their new relationship, and there's a bit of longing and yearning in the middle of it. And then these characters immediately starts this relationship halfway through the book, and I kind of wanted them to stretch out that period of lust and yearning. I really like the sexual tension between two characters when they're not really together, because I like how they're navigating that still. And I was a little disappointed how quickly the relationship evolved in the very beginning. Like halfway through the book, they're already together, and the rest of it is just them navigating that relationship, which I understand is very relevant, especially when it comes to having a same-sex relationship in politics and in a very antiquated system like the royal family of Great Britain, because they're very rigid in their ways, they're very set in their ways, they don't like change, they're very traditional, and that comes with a lot of homophobia. I understand why the last half of the book, these two characters are struggling with what it's going to look like for the Prince of Wales and the son of the US president to have a relationship, but I kind of wanted that yearning, that like very beginning stages of relationship to stretch out a little bit longer, but they're still trying to decide who they are to each other. But I digress. It was still an enjoyable book, but there was one scene where his mom as the president and his father are celebrating Christmas together as a family, and they're divorced in the book. In the movie, I don't think they mentioned divorce. She's married to someone, I think it's Leo, like the stepdad in this book, and you don't ever see like his real father. And in the book, they have this huge shouting match where they're throwing around the F-bomb like a bunch of 12-year-olds, and it just felt very, I don't know, it just felt very childish. I didn't like it. Like the fact that they dropped the F-bomb 5 times within 2 sentences was just too much for me, and it was less impactful, and it just felt, again, very childish. I didn't like that scene. It kind of took me out of the book a little bit. But I would definitely recommend this book. I found it to be very enjoyable. I definitely liked it in a lot of places more than the movie, even though I found the movie to be really sweet too. I definitely recommend experiencing both, but otherwise, Red, White, and Royal Blue, 3 out of 5 stars. Next up on our list, we have Love Theoretically by Ali Hazelwood. And this is actually my first Ali Hazelwood book. I had the Love Hypothesis on my TBR list for 2024. I haven't quite gotten to that one yet. This book was actually available at my library, so I quickly snatched it up and I read through it really quickly, and it was definitely not my favorite book of February. I was very disappointed by it. If you're not familiar with Love Theoretically, it is another sciencey love romance that is Ali Hazelwood's cup of tea. Her books are very similar to Lessons in Chemistry, in which she combines women in STEM with romance. And whereas I like that niche a lot because, again, we don't see a lot of women in STEM represented in literature, I kind of found this book to be very contrived. For a contemporary romance, it did feel very juvenile in the way that it was written. So this book is about this girl named Elsie, working as an adjunct professor at Boston University. And she has this mentor teacher who you kind of learn is kind of a skeevy guy later on. He's kind of holding her back because her true passion, her true dream is to become a researcher and work on her own research when it comes to crystals. I'm not sure exactly what she wants to experiment on because I'm an English major and all science immediately goes over my head. So please do not fault me for not knowing anything. I am just out here in space. And the only reason why I was able to really relate or really retain a lot of what was happening in the book was because I just watched Oppenheimer, and Oppenheimer happens to be a theoretical physicist, which I did not know. And I read this book and I got super excited. I'm like, oh, I know what Oppenheimer is about a little more. I could understand a little bit more. So it did help me to understand in a broader sense like what theoretical physics is about and what it's like compared to experimental physics, ? So I did like this book because it added a whole new layer to Oppenheimer and my experience watching that movie as well, because I didn't really know there was a difference between theoretical physics and experimental. But now that I've seen both sides of the coin, I understand that there is quite quite a bit of difference as well. Like, I'm not a physics girl. I tried physics in high school and I had to drop out of that class because it was too much for me. I have so much respect for all of you physics people out there. Anyone who works in science in general, I just have so much respect for you as an English right brain kind of person. So I was reading this book and I was very lost. I did like Ali Hazelwood's voice and how she makes science very accessible to normal people like me. But I will say overall that this story was kind of lackluster. Elsie is struggling financially. She also has diabetes, so as you can imagine, she has a lot of issues, especially when it comes to healthcare. Again, her medicine and her little pod are very expensive. So she's struggling with that, and she wants a new job, but she can't really afford her bills right now. So not only she's abject professor, so she's kind of doing a lot of free labor for her mentor who's taking advantage of her. She is essentially a female escort to pretend to be people's girlfriend. I found that to be really fascinating, like talking about women's roles not only in the scientific community, but also when it comes to the oldest profession in the world. Talking about women's autonomy not only in the STEM field, but also in other areas of work. But I feel like Ali Hazelwood really dropped the ball on that, because basically she used something that could be a really relevant conversation in a book like this into something that was more of a plot.